Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I'm excited to be able to join you all and host this. My name is Anna. I work at Clean Energy Group as a project associate. And today we are seeing the webinar and environmental justice strategies for hydrogen opposition. Before we go any further, let's go through some quick webinar logistics. If you would like to, you'll notice that you have a webinar console. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. It should look like the picture that's viewed on the presentation slide right now. You can use the console to adjust your audio. Either you can listen from your computer's mic and speakers, or you can call in via your telephone. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode today. Near the bottom of the console, you'll see that there's a box where you can write and submit your questions. We will have a Q&A at the end of this webinar after all of the panelists' presentations. Please submit questions as you think of them. Do not wait until the end of the webinar. If you'd like to view your speakers' presentations in full screen mode, you can do so by clicking that orange arrow. It's circled on your screen here. To be able to expand your webinar console again, you can click that arrow again. One final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar slides and recording after it's concluded. We will also post all of this information to our website, cleanegroup.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because that is also where we post all the information about our upcoming webinars and where you can RSVP to join those webinars as well. So with that information, I will pass this over to our moderator today. Marriele Mango is joining us. She is a project director at Clean Energy Group.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before I go ahead and introduce our presenters, I'm just going to give a quick introduction as to who we are here at the Clean Energy Group. Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit organization working to advance innovation and clean energy technologies through policy, finance, and individual project level support. We also have a sister organization, Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a membership coalition of organizations, primarily state agencies, that manage clean energy funds. Today, our focus is going to be on hydrogen through CEG's Hydrogen Information and Public Education Project, which was started in 2021 to combat fossil fuel industry hype regarding hydrogen fuel. We focus on equipping frontline organizations and communities with the tools they need to critically evaluate hydrogen proposals and to learn more about hydrogen. For fact sheets, articles, just to learn more in general, please visit our website, and my colleague Abbe Ramanan will be talking deeper about hydrogen later on as well. Great, so we have an awesome set of presenters today. The first presenter today is Abbe Ramanan. She's a project director at CEG. Abbe is both at Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance. At CEG, she leads the Hydrogen Information and Public Education Project, which aims to equip advocates, regulators, and policymakers with non-biased facts to counter irresponsible hydrogen proposals. Abbe also supports the development of equitable solar and battery storage projects in underserved communities through CEG's Resilient Power Project, which strives to provide resilient power technologies to underserved communities. In her role at CESA, Abbe specializes in equitable low-income solar policy. She manages the Solar with Justice, Connecting States and Communities project, which focuses on how state agencies can collaborate with community-based organizations to develop impactful, equitable solar policies for underserved communities. Abbe received a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she wrote a master's thesis on state models for improving access to solar energy for LMI communities. Next up, we have Erik Schlenker-Goodrich, Executive Director of Western Environmental Law Center. Erik joined Western Environmental Law Center as a staff attorney in 2003 and became Executive Director in 2012. He has fought in court to safeguard our climate from dirty fossil fuels, promote our transition to a clean energy future, and protect the American West rivers and wildlands. An expert in issues related to oil and gas development, Erik leads WELC's campaigns to phase out fossil fuels and build climate resilience. Prior to joining WELC, he worked as a public lands attorney for the Wilderness Society. Erik is a graduate of Cornell University with a BS in Natural Resources and earned his law degree and a certificate in Environmental and Natural Resources Law from the University of Oregon School of Law. Thanks for being here, Erik. And lastly, we have Sean O'Leary, who's a senior researcher at Ohio Valley Institute. Sean is senior researcher for energy and petrochemicals at the Ohio River Valley Institute, has studied and written about coal, natural gas, and their role in the economies of Appalachia since the beginning of the fracking boom. He is the author of the State of My State blog and newspaper column, which ran in the Martinsburg Journal between 2010 and 2014. Since 2016, Sean has served as a communications director of the Northwest Energy Coalition in Seattle, Washington, where he has helped develop and promote policies advancing the Northwest transition to an emissions-free electric system, just transitions for fossil fuel workers and communities, and the restoration of salmon and orca whales whose survival is threatened by hydropower dams on the lower Snake River. Sean is a native of Wheeling, West Virginia, and is a graduate of Warwood High School and Bethany College. Thank you everyone for being a part of us today. Just to reiterate before I hand it over to Abby, please submit questions throughout. We're going to get to as many as we can at the end. I've already seen a couple roll in, and thank you all for joining us today.
All right, thanks so much, Mari. And I believe I am first up. There we go. All right. And it looks like I now can advance my slides. So hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. My name is Abbe Ramanan. I'm the project director for CEG's Hydrogen and Information and Public Education, or HYPE project. And before we get to the amazing presentations from Erik and Sean, who are going to kind of get into more regional specifics and strategies for opposing hydrogen projects, I want to do a bit of level setting and just kind of put forth some general information on hydrogen and all the issues surrounding it. One thing that we at CEG have noticed, and part of the reason we started the Hydrogen Information and Public Education project, is because we were seeing for frontline communities and community-based organizations and advocates, there's just like there's a real asymmetry in expertise when it comes to hydrogen. You know, a lot of these proposals are relying on really technical details, and they'll have engineers on their side saying one thing. But the fact of the matter is the science around hydrogen proves that it is really problematic for a lot of different aspects of industry and energy. And, you know, we want to make sure that that information is in the hands of those folks who can use it. So what I'm going to get into a little bit today is just some of the most common myths that are used generally by the fossil fuel industry to greenwash hydrogen, and what the facts behind those myths, and why it's a real environmental justice concern. See if I can go back. It's frozen. All right, well, the slide that I flashed by was just a selection. Oh, there we go. All right, overzealous. So a lot of you are probably on this call today because you've been hearing about hydrogen projects in your communities, or you know, your utility has put forth a hydrogen blending proposal. These screenshots of articles that you see here are all just from like a week in November. There's way more kind of hydrogen hype articles out every day. I could probably fill this screen with hundreds and hundreds of hydrogen articles just from this year alone. So yeah, why the hype now, and why exactly is hydrogen being put forth as a solution? A lot of that has to do with, oh God, can I advance slides again? There we go. All right. So a lot of that has to do with what's being defined as clean hydrogen, and I am going to use quotation marks around clean throughout my presentation, because hydrogen, the types of hydrogen being discussed are usually not clean by any means, and so I just don't agree with that definition, which is hence the quotation marks. So 95% of hydrogen produced today is what we call gray hydrogen, or traditionally produced hydrogen. This type of hydrogen has been around for decades. It's used in industry. It's used, you know, for ammonia production and cement making. So that is hydrogen that is made from fossil fuels through a process called steam methane reformation, and it's what we call like dirty or gray hydrogen. Clean hydrogen can be separated out into two separate types of hydrogen production. There's what we call blue hydrogen, and that's hydrogen produced through that same process I just talked about, steam methane reformation, but they deploy carbon capture through the process to capture the carbon emissions associated with using fossil fuels. The quality of that carbon capture is up for debate, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Green hydrogen is hydrogen that is produced through a process called electrolysis, and that if that electrolysis is powered by renewable energy, then the hydrogen it produces green, in that there are no fossil fuels associated with the production process, and that is the only real type of clean or carbon-free hydrogen in the market. If you are seeing hydrogen proposals that are talking about using natural gas, that hydrogen is not green hydrogen, it is not renewable hydrogen, it is blue hydrogen, which is still using fossil fuels, still has emissions associated with the process. So those are the types of hydrogen production. I'm now going to talk about the end uses for that hydrogen. And so there's a couple different end uses for hydrogen, or how the hydrogen, once you produce it, gets used. A common one that a lot of you might have seen, your utility proposing, or a power plant near you suggesting blending hydrogen, is power generation. So hydrogen is blended in a natural gas turbine and combusted for power. Then there's kind of using it for like industrial uses, and that can be either using hydrogen to produce heat for industrial processes, or to use it as a feedstock. So actually using hydrogen in like chemical reactions for things like cement making or steel making, or producing ammonia for fertilizer. And then the other one is using hydrogen in fuel cells. Some of you may have heard of fuel cells. They're similar to a battery, but rather than kind of having electricity that's self-contained in the battery, a fuel cell requires fuel, and one of those fuels can be hydrogen. When hydrogen is run through a fuel cell, it produces electricity, and it doesn't have any emissions associated with the process of running it through a fuel cell. So that is the only time that hydrogen can be used to produce electricity where there are no associated nasty emissions. It's just water. So those are kind of the types of production, and then the end uses. And if I can advance slides, or next slide. So the kind of reasoning behind the fossil fuel industry's greenwashing is they'll take what we'd like to call least regret uses, and this is a framework that several environmental justice advocates have used to evaluate hydrogen proposals, which is essentially hydrogen should really only be used when there's really no other alternatives for electrification or decarbonization available, and using hydrogen will not unduly harm the surrounding community. So those least regret uses, there are a few of those out there. It's one, only using green hydrogen, so that hydrogen produced from renewable energy, not blue hydrogen, nothing that is using fossil fuels, using green hydrogen for things that are really difficult to decarbonize using electrification. So things like heavy duty trucking, aviation, decarbonizing industry, so replacing uses for gray hydrogen that are already in use. Those types of kind of least regret uses are used to greenwash what we like to call most regret uses. So things like power generation, blue hydrogen in general, blending blue hydrogen or even green hydrogen with fossil fuels to extend the life of fossil fuel assets. Those are all most regret uses that do not benefit anyone besides the fossil fuel industry, and those uses are being greenwashed by these sort of nicer, actually least regret uses. So now I'm going to get into kind of the breakdown of kind of the top 5 myths that are used in this context for kind of fossil fuel greenwashing. And so the first myth in general is just the idea that clean hydrogen is emissions free. So as I said earlier, a really common proposal that we've seen in a lot of states by a lot of utilities and power plant owners is blending hydrogen into existing natural gas pipelines and burning it at natural gas turbines to reduce emissions. So number one, there are emissions associated with hydrogen. Hydrogen, when it's combusted, doesn't produce CO2, but it does produce a lot of particulates, and it also produces 6 times the amount of nitrogen oxide as natural gas when it's produced. And for those of you who aren't familiar with nitrogen oxide, or NOx, it's a really harmful air pollutant, causes a ton of public health impacts, causes respiratory illness, heart disease, and for a lot of communities that are located near, for example, peaker power plants that are already dealing with heavy NOx emissions, we have seen the resulting disparities in health outcomes in those communities. So the idea that you're going to be burning something that causes 6 times the amount of those NOx emissions is really scary. And a lot of power plants, they'll say, well, we have emissions controls in place already to deal with those NOx emissions. Those NOx emission controls are formulated to work with natural gas. They're not formulated to work with hydrogen. And for the most part, they can only handle a very small blend of hydrogen. The most is 30%. A lot of operators would say that they're not comfortable doing 30%. It'd be like 20 or 15. Even for new turbines that are formulated to work with hydrogen and have emissions controls for hydrogen, the NOx is still only at legal levels. And as we've seen, those legal levels still are causing health disparities. So next slide. The other really common myth is that clean hydrogen can help states meet their decarbonization goals. And there's kind of several different arguments to unpack here. The first is a really common one is folks will say, well, we have all this excess renewable capacity that's just being wasted, and we can use that excess capacity to generate green hydrogen and use it as a form of long duration storage. So number one, I just want to clarify that by long duration storage, that is producing hydrogen fuel and storing it in tanks somewhere. And then that fuel either needs to be run through a fuel cell or combusted and a power plant to be reconverted into electricity. The other thing is that excess capacity can mean a lot of different things. But most of the time that excess capacity where you have a renewable asset that's producing more energy than you can use on the grid, those are for really short periods of time. And for most green hydrogen production, you need an electrolyzer that is running continuously. So you're not really going to be just using it when you have excess capacity. You'd be using it when you have excess capacity. You'd be using it when you have regular capacity. It'd be a huge demand on this renewable asset. And green hydrogen production is really inefficient. Efficiency of green hydrogen's life cycle, when you're putting electricity into an electrolyzer and then putting it out and then either running it through a fuel cell or combusting it to then produce electricity again, is only around 30%, which means you're losing 70% of the energy that's put in. So if you're looking at decarbonization, you really have to be thinking about where all that renewable energy is going. You need it to, it should be going directly to decarbonizing the grid. If you have enough to be losing 75% of that renewable energy to then be producing green hydrogen to store for some indeterminate period of time, that's great. But for most states, they're still trying to get to that 100% renewable energy just for their grid to begin with. So, the excess capacity argument is definitely not a concern. And then also, if those electrolyzers are, for example, not connected directly to a renewable energy asset, if they're just running off of the existing power grid, there's actually a great study that was done by Princeton a few weeks ago looking at the emissions from grid-connected electrolyzers, and they found that those could actually be 2 times worse than conventional gray hydrogen. So again, you really have to be considering where are your renewable assets, where's that power going towards, and is it the best use of those assets to be producing green hydrogen? Because if they're not, then you'd actually end up in a worse situation than you were before. And then that's not even getting into blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen, where you're pairing carbon capture and storage with hydrogen production, also because you're extending the life of fossil fuels, has associated methane emissions, and you also need power to be running those carbon capture and storage technologies. So you actually need more power to produce blue hydrogen than you need to produce gray hydrogen. That means you actually get even worse greenhouse gas emissions producing blue hydrogen than you do for producing conventional hydrogen or for just burning coal. And then finally, for all of these things, a lot of fossil fuel industry folks will say, well, but if you are blending hydrogen into a natural gas mix, you at least get a reduction in CO2 emissions. And that's true, you do get a reduction in CO2 emissions, but it's not a linear reduction. You don't get a 30% blend of hydrogen does not equal a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions because of hydrogen's difference in densities. You actually only end up getting a 14% reduction in carbon emissions. And keep in mind that for a lot of these existing natural gas infrastructure, they can't handle a blend higher than 30%. So this is really only to get a tiny reduction in carbon emissions compared to, say, just switching over to renewables on the grid. Next slide. And then going back to the natural gas infrastructure, a very common myth is that hydrogen can be safely blended in existing pipelines and run through existing natural gas infrastructure. So hydrogen is a very, very tiny molecule. Some of you may remember it's the first one on the periodic table. It's super small. And as part of that, it can be really hard to contain. And for example, if you run hydrogen through steel, it goes through a process called embrittlement, where the hydrogen diffuses through the alloy and it creates all these little tiny cracks. And there's a lot of reporting out there that, oh, well, because of the embrittlement issue, we'll just run low blends of hydrogen through pipelines. There's actually been studies done that show that it's not an issue of how much hydrogen is in a pipeline, it's an issue of the pressure at which that hydrogen is being run through a pipeline. And at typical kind of pipeline pressures for natural gas, hydrogen is likely to increase or reduce resistance to fracture, which is basically a way of saying increased likelihood of cracks in pipelines by more than 50%, which is pretty scary. So it's really, if hydrogen is being pumped through a steel pipeline, it's not a matter of, oh, well, there's a safe level of blending. There isn't, and it's really just a matter of when a potential rupture event could occur. And finally, we also don't even have technology that's sensitive enough to capture the rate of hydrogen leaks before a rupture occurs. So there's no real way of monitoring this beyond, kind of waiting for an explosion to happen. So there's really no way for hydrogen to be blended safely in existing natural gas pipelines that are made out of steel. Next slide. And then another really common one folks love to say is, well, hydrogen will save ratepayers money. So number one, you just heard about how you can't use it through existing infrastructure. So any use of hydrogen is going to require new infrastructure projects, which cost a lot of money, and a lot of the money is going to be borne out by ratepayers. And green and blue hydrogen are both still really expensive to produce, even with all the new federal incentives that are going to be coming out. So starting to blend hydrogen into existing natural gas fuel is likely to raise the price of fuel to about 2 to 4 times that of natural gas alone. So even without the concern around infrastructure replacement, you're still increasing the price of fuel to begin with. And then finally, even for areas where there are existing hydrogen pipelines that have been used to transport gray hydrogen, particularly in the Southeast, all those pipelines are accounted for, and they're accounted for by folks not involved in power generation. They're accounted for by folks using chemical plants or petroleum plants or cement makers, steel manufacturers. So any power producer who's talking about hydrogen saving ratepayers money, they're still talking about infrastructure projects. And there's no glide path to 100% hydrogen. Like I just said earlier, most existing infrastructure can only handle a blend of about 30% hydrogen. So there's no world in which you're able to gradually increase the amount of hydrogen in a pipeline or at a turbine without having to replace all of the existing infrastructure in order to be able to safely combust it. So any natural gas infrastructure that's being used to burn or run a blend of hydrogen and natural gas is still going to be a stranded asset eventually. This isn't a way to reuse existing assets or save money that way. Next slide. And then this is another favorite of mine, is just the idea that hydrogen doesn't contribute to global warming at all. So hydrogen is still an indirect greenhouse gas. While it itself doesn't contribute to global warming, hydrogen in the atmosphere will, there's a bit of science that occurs, but basically it extends the lifetime of methane. And most of us know that methane actually has a greater warming impact in the first 10 to 20 years that it's in the atmosphere compared to CO2. So that's really concerning if we're building out a bunch of new hydrogen projects that are, as I said earlier, really prone to leakage. We're seeing greater, the increase of methane in the atmosphere because of greater leakages from hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is a particularly bad example of this because you're getting both the increase in hydrogen and an increase in methane leaks because you're extending the life of natural gas and using methane upstream. So a study done by Columbia actually found that with blue hydrogen, you could actually get leakage rates that could yield up to 60% more warming in the first 10 years of use compared to just continuing in a business as usual scenario. Next slide. So there's all these myths you just heard. Hydrogen extends the life of fossil fuel infrastructure. It's really expensive. It's not going to save anyone money. It doesn't help meet decarbonization goals. Despite all that, a lot of these projects are moving forward, and part of that is because there's a lot of federal incentives out there. So a few things that are going to be discussed later in this call that I just want to make sure folks were aware of. One, federal funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law includes $9.5 billion for hydrogen hubs, and these are regional hubs that are required to look at different types of hydrogen production. So there's clean hydrogen from fossil fuels, from renewable energy, as well as nuclear. And there's already several proposals for hubs around the country that are going forward. So that's definitely of major concern. Next slide. And then the other piece of kind of federal incentives for hydrogen is in the IRA or the IRA. There's an indefinite clean hydrogen production tax credit, providing incentives for any hydrogen that falls under their definition of clean, which is 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide or equivalent emissions per kilogram of hydrogen. So that's for blue hydrogen, that's for green hydrogen. And then there's also additional tax credits for just carbon capture by itself. And that's an incentive per metric ton of carbon dioxide that's captured and stored, but that's really only looking at it at the point of capture. It's not determining how long that carbon is actually being stored. So that's just another stacked incentive. And with all of these, it's really important to just consider that we don't know necessarily just the extent to which hydrogen emissions can impact greenhouse gases, how this can impact NOx emissions for communities. And so that's going to be a really important piece of the guidance that comes out, is how these incentives are going to be administered, because we really need super sensitive emissions calculations models beyond just GREET that can capture just the impact for these communities. Next slide. So, I mean, based on everything you've heard, and I feel like I'm kind of probably preaching to the choir here, but these are all just really huge concerns for environmental justice communities. Any hydrogen that's used to extend the life of fossil fuel assets is an EJ issue. Hydrogen that contributes to air pollution is an EJ issue. Hydrogen that increases energy burden is a EJ issue. And our focus at Clean Energy Group, and I think for a lot of groups moving forward, is going to be making sure that even with these hydrogen proposals that are moving forward, thanks to the federal incentives, we do our best to limit the harm that comes to communities and make sure that public health and other harms aren't being perpetuated in the name of jobs or economic development. Next slide. And that's my little overview on hydrogen. I hope this was helpful for some of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow presenters. Thanks.
Oops, Sean, I think that you're on mute still.
Excuse me, everybody. Thanks for the handoff. I'm Sean O'Leary from the Ohio River Valley Institute. And if you could go to the next slide. We're located in a region of the country which includes the Appalachian counties of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky that happens to be kind of a focal point for fossil fuel extraction and generation, both natural gas and coal. And so as a result of that heritage and that established industrial base, we're looking at two pretty distinct and pretty starkly opposed options for how decarbonization is going to take place in our region. One route that's available to us is the route that probably most of the country will follow, and that is decarbonizing by means of transitioning to renewable resources for the most part. But the other pathway that's available is one that's built on the back of the existing fossil fuel industries in the region. And that transition would be enabled by blue hydrogen, which was just mentioned a moment ago, combined with carbon capture and sequestration and a variety of other industries. If you could go to the next slide. And so the scenario that we're looking at in what would effectively be a dirty energy transition in our region is one in which we would see gas-fired power plants, coal-fired power plants, and other factories that emit large volumes of carbon be retrofitted with carbon capture technology that would grab carbon emissions, most, not all, but grab most carbon emissions and pipe them underground for long-term storage. At the same time, we would see the emergence of blue hydrogen, which, as was just explained a moment ago, is derived from methane, from natural gas, through a process called steam reforming. And the carbon from that process would also be piped and stored underground. And of course, the promise that's being made to folks in our region is that blue hydrogen can be used to serve a variety of applications throughout our economy, heating homes and buildings, powering automobiles, jets, light trucks, heavy trucks, long-haul shipping, steel making, cement, fertilizer. All of these are being held out as markets for blue hydrogen made from methane, enabled through a process called carbon capture. If you could go to the next slide. Now, in terms of what that process actually looks like in terms of a footprint, what it will mean on the ground for us is that the little map that you can see right now shows the state of Pennsylvania. And the map plots the footprint of the carbon capture pipelines that have been proposed as part of Pennsylvania's application to the Department of Energy to be designated as a hydrogen hub. And again, we're looking only at Pennsylvania right now. This doesn't include West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky, which would also be incorporated into a larger regional hydrogen hub. But even what we're looking at here represents about 1,400 square miles of pipeline in the region, and it would connect gas and coal-fired power plants as well as factories, as I just mentioned a moment ago. But despite how extensive that network is, it would only capture about 2/3 of the carbon being emitted by those structures. In other words, when we talk about decarbonizing by means of hydrogen and carbon capture, we're not talking about decarbonizing nearly as much as will be necessary if our region is going to achieve reductions consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The other issue that I should point out is that while the Department of Energy and proponents talk about a hydrogen hub, in fact, hydrogen really doesn't have very much to do with most of this. Only about 15% of the carbon that would be captured would actually come from hydrogen. Between 85 and 90% of the carbon being captured would come from coal and gas-fired power plants. If you could go to the next slide. And the push to do that is being driven, as was again just mentioned a moment ago, by the Infrastructure Bill and more recently by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is providing billions of dollars of grants to seed the creation of hydrogen hubs throughout the country. And it's combining those with massive subsidies for carbon capture and sequestration. The figure that you see on the screen of $85 per metric ton is basically a 100% plus subsidy to industry for the capture of carbon and both, as I mentioned before, from coal and gas-fired power plants. Meanwhile, hydrogen is also going to receive great subsidies. Now, what's interesting is the subsidies for green hydrogen in the IRA are actually more generous than they are for blue hydrogen, because blue hydrogen's dirtier footprint doesn't allow it to achieve the highest levels of subsidy available from the federal government. Nonetheless, we are in a scenario where between carbon capture and blue hydrogen, taxpayers rather than industry would be paying the vast bulk of the costs for all of this. If you could go to the next slide. And of course, that has induced a feeding frenzy in industry and among state governments that are putting together proposals to apply for Department of Energy funds that are out there. The only problem with that is that when you look at the economic case for blue hydrogen and carbon capture as a means of decarbonization, the case kind of falls apart. And it falls apart for a number of reasons. First of all, I had mentioned that power generation from gas and coal-fired power plants actually would represent about almost 90% of the carbon to be captured from our region. However, when you try to retrofit those plants with carbon capture equipment, the effect is to double the cost of power generation from gas-fired plants and triple the cost from coal plants. In other words, it's not a great idea, and it's a cost that would fall on taxpayers and ratepayers. And then at the end, if you're not going to be able, and if that turns out, by the way, to not be economically feasible, then you vastly undercut the economics for building that massive pipeline network that we were looking at a moment ago. The other problem with the vision that's being presented to the region is that many of the applications that are being talked about for hydrogen, like heating homes and buildings, powering light transportation, and most other forms of transportation, it's not economical in those markets either. The National Renewable Energy Labs took a very detailed look at hydrogen and its ability to perform various functions competitively in the marketplace. And basically it found that hydrogen is really only cost competitive in areas like steelmaking, very hard to electrify activities. And those activities, which may be necessary because, as I said, they are hard to electrify, are small enough and few enough in number that it is likely that any need or value that a hydrogen would have in those areas could be met by green hydrogen. If you could go to the next slide, please. Nonetheless, we're seeing, as I had mentioned before, a massive push from government and from industry in our region to do this. And the challenge, the question that we're facing in our region is how much effort and resources will be squandered on a false solution that is not even likely to come to fruition. And unfortunately, that's been an ongoing track record in our region. Ever since the natural gas fracking boom began back in about the year 2008, we have seen a succession of promises, of grandiose visions for what this would mean for the region in terms of jobs and economic development. First, there was the Appalachian Storage Hub, which never came to fruition. Then we were told there would be a petrochemical renaissance where we would see the build out of a petrochemical industry on a scale comparable to the industry in the Gulf Coast. That never came to fruition. And now we're being told that a hydrogen hub will be an economic game changer for the region. But the common denominator in all of those stories is that the claims are made, industry gets the money, it gets the subsidies, it gets the regulatory relaxation, but the jobs and the economic prosperity never arrive. If you could go to the next slide. Going back to the beginning of the fracking boom in Appalachia, we've seen a pattern repeated consistently, and we understand the reasons why this pattern repeats. It is that with the boom in natural gas, GDP skyrockets in the region. However, when you look at measures of prosperity like job growth and population growth, not only do we not see a commensurate rise in those categories with the rise in GDP, we actually see negative impacts. The job performance and population growth in counties that benefited, and I use that phrase advisedly, from the natural gas boom, the job loss and population loss in major natural gas counties is as great or greater than it is in rural counties that never participated in the natural gas boom. If you could go to the next slide, please. And so that's why the Ohio River Valley Institute recently commissioned the analytics firm Stratagen to do an analysis to develop an alternative decarbonization pathway for the greater Ohio Valley region, focusing specifically on southwestern Pennsylvania. And what we found is that doing decarbonization through a renewables-based transition strategy in which natural gas plays only a tiny part for grid balancing purposes, and in which carbon capture plays no role at all, turns out to be far more effective at reducing emissions as well as local pollutants, which are a chronic problem in our region. It's a less expensive solution, and it's far better for growth and prosperity. And so just this past Monday, we released the study. We're inviting everyone in this audience, policymakers and residents in our region, to please visit OhioRiverValleyInstitute.com and learn more about this option, because as we choose which of the two paths I described at the beginning we should go down, we need to choose the one that does the best job of reducing emissions at the least cost and with the greatest positive economic impact. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Hey folks, my name is Erik Schlenker-Goodrich. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center based in Taos. And just a big shout out to both Sean and to Abbe for providing evidence-rich information. I think my presentation will follow on very effectively from that, in particular providing a story about how all these hydrogen issues have landed in New Mexico, my home state, the land of enchantment. And it's interesting to me to see the parallels, especially with Sean's region. Next. Place I want to start with hydrogen is the reality and how we approach it is from an intersectional lens, that hydrogen, and as Abbe and Sean talked about, very much involving fossil fuels, very much involving the imperative for us to transition economically from an energy sector in order to account for the climate crisis. The climate crisis, of course, implicates issues of human health and safety, also implicates issues of equity and justice, land protection, and that's the way we fundamentally approach the hydrogen issue. And we think that that's a source of power, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. But stepping back just a little bit, in New Mexico, we have always been a fossil fuel state, and over the course of the past 2 years, hydrogen has really reared its head as this prospective solution to all of our ills here in New Mexico, and as a pathway to a clean energy future. And the more we looked into it, the more we rejected it. But we're up against very powerful forces. And in 2021, our governor, a Democratic governor, who has ostensibly been a climate champion, indicated that she was going to make an intensive push in our last legislative session earlier this year in January and February to turn New Mexico into a hydrogen hub. And she had the support of Democrats and some Republicans in both our House and Senate, in our state legislature, and in particular had the chair of our Appropriations and Finance Committee, which is a very powerful position here in the state. And we were able to defeat 4 separate bills in our past legislative session. Each one of those bills was really about taking state public money and transitioning it to prop up a new fossil gas-based hydrogen hub in the region that would take otherwise retired coal-fired power plants and put them back into use as fossil gas hydrogen hubs. And we realized that the way that we had to defeat those was to look through an intersectional lens. Next. Starting point for a lot of our analysis in New Mexico, because we are a fossil gas state and because the transition is so important, and given the global nature of the climate crisis, is really understanding that we need to not only minimize emissions from the production of oil and gas, we need to phase out production. We need to stop building new oil and gas fields, and we need to tilt existing oil and gas fields into decline and to retire those oil and gas fields as swiftly as possible. Next. And so in New Mexico, as we started to think about this basic reality, and as we were presented with all of these hydrogen proposals, fossil gas hydrogen proposals, different groups had different perspectives on this. They were looking and doing their own research, trying to figure out how hydrogen did not fit into their particular mission, and we realized that that was a risk. So one of the things that we did at Western Environmental Law Center is we went out and we listened to folks, and we talked to a lot of folks in a lot of our partner organizations, in particular in frontline and community-based groups. And what emerged was that, notwithstanding somewhat different perspectives, there were also aligned values and also aligned principles that all of the groups shared. So along with all of the groups on this slide, we convened a gathering of those principles. And I'm going to run through those principles because they were the basis for our organizing. And they were also the basis for our power in the legislature to maintain solidarity and what I kind of jokingly referred to during the legislative session as herd strength. Herd strength. You know, we needed to stick together in order for us to have an optimal outcome in the legislative session. And in that, if we allowed political leaders to try to break us apart, and they did try to do that, that would be to our disadvantage and compromise our principles. So these principles were an organizing principle, and that organizing principle translated into power during the legislative session. Next. First principle in New Mexico for us was the fact that we needed a comprehensive climate framework in place before we could even really think about hydrogen and whether any kind of hydrogen, whether fossil gas hydrogen or water-based hydrogen, had a role in our state. And our state didn't have any comprehensive framework. The governor had established an executive order that provided for greenhouse gas emissions reductions over time, but we had no idea how hydrogen would or would not fit into that mix. So a key principle for us was asking, or effectively demanding, that the legislature and the governor first put in place a comprehensive climate framework to provide an effective assessment of whether or not hydrogen was a good thing or a bad thing overall. We were also acutely conscious of all of the federal laws that were being contemplated at the time, the bipartisan infrastructure law. We didn't know about the Inflation Reduction Act at that time. But with both of those acts, I think one of our perspectives has been there's a lot of promise in those laws, but there's also a lot of peril. And so part of our approach to these laws is how do we fulfill the promise and how do we minimize the peril of these laws? And that federal funding was driving the debate in New Mexico, which only increased the imperative for us to put in place a state-level comprehensive climate framework. And we didn't see any of that information. And with all of these principles, what we did was we put them down in a letter, and there's a link at the end of my presentation so you can access that letter. And then we submitted it to the governor's office and to the state agencies that were leading the push on developing hydrogen legislation. Because we didn't want to be so aggressive to say absolutely not, because the state hadn't been, frankly, very transparent on this. And so we wanted to put it in a framework of asking legitimate, important questions that were grounded in these principles. So that's the basis of all of these slides. These are the questions that we asked for answers to, and frankly, never really received answers to. Next. Second principle for us was equity and justice, and that we had to approach any consideration of hydrogen policy through an equity and justice lens. And I want to pause here a little bit, especially that third bullet there about trickle-down logic, because I've seen this argument emerge, especially with debates in Congress that are happening literally today, involving permitting reform, ostensibly to accelerate clean energy, but really are a package of fossil fuel concessions, including direct approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And the idea is that if you reduce emissions, necessarily you are furthering equity and justice. No, if to further equity and justice, you have to center equity and justice, and you have to put it on a level playing field with greenhouse gas emission reductions. That's an intersectional approach that I think is an imperative for us to move forward, both to account for the climate crisis, but to do so in a way that delivers on equity and justice. That's not just a function of doing what is morally and ethically right. I think there's also just a pragmatic component of building power and solidarity, because in order for us to get through the climate crisis, we need to do so together. And if we don't do so together and we simply recreate bad pathways, capitalistic tendencies to exploit resources, maximize profit, etc., we don't see that as a very effective pathway. So I just fundamentally reject that trickle-down logic and the need for us to prioritize and center equity and justice. And that was really key to our push to defeat those bad bills and our footing for the future, because the fight is very much not over. Next. Third principle was, and this goes to a lot of what Sean was saying, that New Mexico was, in many respects, is in the mix of a transition away from, at least in terms of the electricity generating sector, moving away from coal-fired power towards renewables. We had already shut down, for example, the Escalante coal-fired power plant. We had shut down 2 units of the San Juan generating station, and we had passed what was called the Energy Transition Act that would fully retire the San Juan generating station, which as of right now, is not burning any coal or producing electricity, even though they're now trying to repurpose that to a carbon capture facility and continuing to burn coal, and it's a big boondoggle in its own right. But the key here was we were very concerned that fossil gas hydrogen would in fact divert public resources and attention away from our transition to renewable energy, and basically preclude further investment that was needed in a renewable energy future. And that's key in a fossil fuel state, given how dependent we are on fossil gas resources. We're very worried that what a fossil gas hydrogen hub would do would essentially perpetuate the state's dependency on oil and gas revenue and perpetuate the harms from those existing oil and gas fields. We have 60,000 oil and gas wells in New Mexico. Next. Now, because we have so much fossil gas infrastructure in New Mexico, both from oil wells where you have associated gas that's produced in conjunction with the oil production, but then also just straight up natural gas wells, how is a hydrogen economy going to, in fact, minimize impacts to people, to the communities, to land? And we saw no evidence of that in terms of how the state was approaching the development of a hydrogen hub. How would alleged emissions reduction actually align with science-based guardrails to constrain warming below 2 degrees Celsius? And so we asked those questions, never got answers to them, and that's what we continue to push for. But this proved to be an effective tool for us to argue against the logic of those hydrogen bills that really did not regulate hydrogen. Rather, they simply set this conditions for how hydrogen would be subsidized with state public money. Next. I want to just give a sense of New Mexico, because I've talked a lot about our dependency on oil and gas. All those little dots on there, every one of those dots is an oil and gas well in New Mexico. Again, we have a little over 60,000 oil and gas wells. Those are concentrated in the northwest part of the state. This is on and near the Navajo Nation and also native communities outside the Navajo Nation itself. So huge environmental justice implications, indigenous rights implications. This is an area called Greater Chaco. It is a sacred landscape to both Dene people, Navajo people, and also Pueblo people and other native peoples, period. It's also just a fantastic landscape, but it's a sacrifice zone for oil and gas. And then the other primary oil and gas producing region in New Mexico is down in the southeast part of the state. This is the Permian Basin, the New Mexico side of the Permian Basin. And just to give you a sense of the EJ implications, up in the San Juan Basin, there are 6,500 kids under the age of 5 that live within half a mile of an oil and gas well. That's astounding. I mean, I've gone out into the region, and you can see oil and gas wells a stone's throw away from public schools. It's absurd. Next. And here's that figure about the 6,500 kids under the age of 5 living within an oil and gas well. This is up in San Juan County, the area in the yellow box, the gray shaded yellow box up in the upper left-hand corner. And this is all thanks to EDF data. Next slide.
Hi, Eric. Just before you start Principle 5, I just want to make sure we're all cognizant of the time and see if you can wrap up by 2 so we can hopefully get to a question or 2.
Yep.
Thanks.
I'll burn through. Key here is Sean went into this as well. Are we in fact investing in hydrogen as a climate and energy transition tool? Our fundamental answer to that when we did our research was absolutely not, that it didn't make financial or economic sense. Next slide. Part of that was part of the basis for that was the notion that fossil gas hydrogen, or blue hydrogen, was about to be uncompetitive with green hydrogen as soon as 2030. Why would we invest in an energy system that was soon to be supplanted by green hydrogen? It made absolutely no sense to us. Next slide. For more information on this, I'd really encourage you to look at Michael Liebrich's hydrogen ladder. I drop a link to that at the end of my presentation, and it really looks at how the hype around hydrogen is very limited. That yes, there is a role for hydrogen in very narrow, hard to decarbonize sectors, but the notion that it's some kind of fuel to transport energy to all sorts of different sectors, we think is entirely bogus. And Michael Liebrich, who is just a very good analyst, has really disabused at least me of any notion that it is more than something for hard to decarbonize sectors. Next slide. Sixth principle with green hydrogen. We in New Mexico, we're an arid state. So are we producing, if there's an investment in green hydrogen, is that coming from freshwater resources? Is that coming from brackish waters underground? Or is it coming from produced water from oil and gas that would operate to further perpetuate oil and gas industry by giving them another value chain that allowed them to continue drilling? Bad idea. So skeptical of green hydrogen in New Mexico. Next slide. Infrastructure concerns, Abbe went into this quite a bit. One thing that I want to lift up is not only the infrastructure concerns with the delivery and transport of hydrogen through, for example, embrittlement of those pipelines, but then the premise for fossil gas hydrogen is carbon capture and sequestration, which of course is dubious to achieve the emissions reductions at scale that they promise, but then also requires the build out of significant infrastructure in its own right that has impacts, especially cumulative impacts in areas that have already been hammered by oil and gas. Next slide. So key takeaways from New Mexico. Key thing, we can't just reduce emissions. We need to reduce emissions at scale to achieve science-based guardrails. Again, keeping warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. That when you're thinking about hydrogen, you have to think about full action of decarbonizing the economy. That means a comprehensive climate framework. In the absence of that, I'm skeptical you can have a good climate, a good framework for hydrogen. And you also have to think about a transition of our state economy, which is a fossil fuel dependent economy, away from fossil fuels entirely because of the entrenched power that the oil and gas industry has. There's a socio-political element here where so long as oil and gas is in power, we're not going to be able to transition effectively. Abbe and Sean went into the variety of impacts and economic risks that hydrogen presents. And I want to land at the same place that Sean landed on, which is all these unmet promises of investing in fossil fuels as somehow the solution to the future and creating a thriving economic base. It just strikes us as a very, very unmet promise historically and risks making promises to communities in the past that will sideline those communities and create further problems down the line. So we think hydrogen is a bit of a boondoggle. It's far overhyped. Big problem. We've been able to defeat it thus far in New Mexico, defeating 4 bills in the last legislative session. We're very cognizant that the funding coming from the federal level makes that an ongoing fight. And if you go to the next slide, and the next slide, these are 2 slides that have hyperlinks to a variety of further reading for folks to help inform their fights on the ground in their communities. And for folks who are in agency governments, working with them, I'd really encourage you to think about the importance of equity and justice, because if you want to move forward with good policy and you're not doing so through a lens of equity and justice, you are likely to trigger backlash, and that backlash has the capacity to derail whatever you're doing and waste everybody's time and money in the process. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you so much, Sean and Abbe as well. Perfect timing. We've hit the top of the hour. Apologies, Erik, for making you rush those last couple of slides. We'll make sure in future webinars that we give hydrogen the time and space it needs, probably elongating the webinar by a couple more minutes in the future. Just a note, the further reading slide on your screen now, we'll upload that as well as the rest of the presentation slides from today to our website, and you'll be able to click on those hyperlinks once they're uploaded online. Erik and Sean, are you all able to stay on for about 10 minutes or so that we can get some, be able to hear some of the Q&A?
Sure.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I will pass it over to Mari then to ask you all some questions. Thank you all so much.
Great, we're gonna try to get through a couple questions. Thank you, everyone. We have a lot of questions, so I encourage, if I don't get to yours, please feel free to reach out to Abbe or I, and we'll make sure to reach out to the appropriate panelists to get an answer. So what I wanted to start with was for you, Abbe. Someone asked that they were unaware that burning hydrogen produces particulates. Can you explain a little bit more about what burning hydrogen actually emits?
Yeah, so I will caveat, I'm not a scientist, so I might get this wrong, but basically hydrogen burns very, very hot, and NOx forms, nitrogen oxide forms as a result of temperature. So in a natural gas turbine, they are still getting NOx formation, but it's just a lesser amount of NOx formation because they're able to control the temperature so that it doesn't have as much opportunity to form. With hydrogen, because it burns so hot, if you are burning a blend of hydrogen and natural gas, it is naturally going to blend hotter. So that's how you get the higher amounts of NOx formation. And that's also why existing NOx emissions controls are not as effective for hydrogen. And I'm happy to share links to studies that explain that further.
Great, thank you. Sean, this one's for you. Would you anticipate better job performance or more availability of jobs in Appalachia from renewable energies like wind, solar, and nuclear compared to what those would be made through a hydrogen type industry?
Yes, and in fact, sometime late next month, we will have a paper coming out examining the comparative job creation characteristics, particularly of energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is a bit of a buzz phrase, but what we're talking about are things like HVAC, door and window replacement, insulation. All of those activities that reduce energy consumption also happen to be among the most jobs intensive sectors of our economy. And last year we issued a report citing the example of the town of Centralia, Washington, which is an old coal town that lost its mine and is in the process of losing its power plant, but which has seen a jobs boom, in large part because the community, the county actually, used $55 million in economic transition funding to invest in distributed generation and energy efficiency primarily. And as a result, despite the closures of their largest employers, are seeing immense growth. And in January, a study by Ohio State University is going to document the causal nature of that relationship and do it. And they are finding that the model created in Centralia is in fact replicable in places like Appalachia, which is why we're thrilled to be part of that effort.
Great, thank you. Erik, I'm going to start with you on this one and then pass it over, because we do have a lot of questions related to water, and I know that this isn't a water, wouldn't touch a lot on that, but if you could, we've got a couple questions regarding if any of your work focused on where water comes from for hydrogen in like the Southwest and how that plays into your advocacy efforts with partners.
Yeah, that's actually an area we're starting to lean into now, because the proposals thus far on the table have been centered on fossil gas hydrogen rather than green hydrogen. So I confess I don't have a great answer to that, with the exception of noting that in New Mexico, we are very concerned about the freshwater usage because of such limited water availability, especially in areas, for example, up in Greater Chaco. You have a lot of folks, Dene folks, who live in areas that they don't actually have access to fresh water now. So to take limited freshwater resources and to divert those to fossil gas, to green hydrogen production, rather than delivering them to families who have not had access to fresh water, strikes us as a problem. You also have coal-fired power plants that are retiring that had large water rights to, for example, the San Juan River up in Greater Chaco. We don't want to see water rights that have been used by fossil fuels go to prop up additional energy industries that, again, may be to the detriment of communities. Last thing I'll mention on this is with produced water. So produced water is water produced as a result of the fracking process. And what a lot of the oil and gas industry is trying to do is figure out ways to monetize the produced water to deal with it, because otherwise it's a limiting factor on any further oil and gas production. And so we're worried about the use of produced water to prop up a green hydrogen economy, because that could create a value chain for the oil and gas producers and thus perpetuate the oil and gas fields that might otherwise tip over into retirement, especially with a lot of these marginal oil and gas fields that aren't making a lot of money right now, aren't producing a lot of oil and gas, sometimes get refracked, or they want to extend out the drilling by drilling new wells into new formations and creating new streams of produced water. So really conscious of that produced water side as well.
Mari, could I chime in on this one as well?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that earlier when I went through my presentation, I pointed out that if you look at the applications for which hydrogen, those hard to electrify sectors where hydrogen may actually have value as an alternative resource, those applications are few enough and far enough in between that if we confine hydrogen to just those applications where it does make economic sense, then there is enough water out there to support it and to execute that. And the other part of it is that, you know, coming from a region where fracking is pretty overwhelming, right now the Marcellus and Utica fields in Appalachia are producing about 40% of all the natural gas that's produced in the United States. Fracking is an incredibly water-intensive activity. And in fact, if we were to transition using water that's currently being used to frack to being used to produce green hydrogen, we would see very little change in overall water consumption. So yes, it is a huge concern. Yes, we must confine hydrogen to just those uses where it makes economic sense. And if we do that, then we can do green hydrogen in a way that is both cost effective and also respectful of our need to preserve, you know, very scarce water resources.
Thanks, Sean. And as someone who just recently moved to Pennsylvania, a new Philadelphia resident here, your presentation especially touched off some saving links on my end. So thank you for that input for the region. We have time for one last question. Abbe, I'm going to throw it over to you to close us out, because I think Sean gave us a great segue into it, which is a couple people just asked, could you reiterate what industries you do think hydrogen is appropriate for, and where so far have you seen that the research indicates, okay, this might be the one, this might be an area that green hydrogen works?
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, Sean did a great job of kind of talking about that as well, but there are several very hard to decarbonize sectors. And I'm talking like that last 95%. is where green hydrogen could have some applicable uses. So things like industrial high heat, and that's temperatures above 400 degrees Celsius. So I'm talking about things that can't be reached with solar concentrating or other kind of measures. Hydrogen can be a good use there. Running hydrogen in fuel cells for things like heavy duty trucking, so not like light duty vehicles or anything like that, but like long haul trucking and aviation, as well as shipping, are all areas that hydrogen could have some potential use because they're really hard to electrify otherwise. But yeah, very limited use, very narrow realm of use where it really does make sense to use green hydrogen.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists. I know I only got to a fraction of the questions, so again, I encourage anyone, Abby and I's contacts out there, if you have any questions or you'd like to be connected, please reach out and we'll go from there. But this is definitely a burgeoning topic, and it was really great to have you all on here today. So I don't know, Anna, I think we have one last slide. Here we go. For anyone who's interested in upcoming webinars, we have a bunch. One that's near and dear to my heart is that we'll be going through for energy storage, the Inflation Reduction Act on the 16th. That's going to be an exciting webinar, as well as State of the U.S. Energy Storage Industry 2022 Year in Review. It's always one of our most popular webinars every year, and I encourage you all to check out the rest of the great ones that we have coming up in the new year. So thank you again to everyone. Reach out if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.